Christmas time was approaching. Snow was starting to fall. Shoppers choosing their presents. People filling the mall. Children waiting for Santa with excitement and glee. A little girl tugged my sweater. She looked up and asked me,
"Where's the line to see Jesus? Is he here at the store? If Christmas time is his birthday, why don't we see him more?"
As I stood in amazement at this message profound, I looked down to thank her. She was nowhere around. The little girl at the mall might as well have had wings. As the tears filled my eyes, I thought I heard her sing, "Where's the line to see Jesus? Is he here at the store? If Christmas time is his birthday, why don't we see him more? Where's the line to see Jesus? He was born for me. Santa Claus brought me presents, but Christ gave his life for me. In the blink of an eye, at the sound of his trump, we'll all stand in line at his throne. Every knee shall bow down, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord." Where's the line to see Jesus? Is he here at the store? If Christmas time is his birthday, why don't we see him more? Where's the line to see Jesus? He was born for me. Santa Claus brought me presents, but Christ gave his life for me. Where's the line? Where's the line? Where's the line for the Lord?
Amen. Open to Matthew 2 and put a bookmark there, and then Psalm 2, put a bookmark there. Make it easier in our flow as we get into this. Matthew 2, Psalm 2, mark that, and then turn to our primary text this morning in Revelation 12. Revelation 12. Let's pray. Father, again, the song is a tremendous reminder. It brought to my mind exactly what Jesus said about himself, that wide is the path that leads to destruction, and many are on it. Narrow is the path that leads to eternal life, and only a few take that path. I pray, Father, that there are those here this morning who are not on that narrow path, that they would be able to see this, especially with this time of year, the Christmas season, Lord. That they would see this narrow path that Christ has carved out for us from his own blood. We thank you for that, God. It's a simple path. It's an easy path, but it's so difficult in a world that fills us with so many other distractions, Lord. Help us not to be distracted this morning. as we gaze in your eternal word. In Christ's name, amen. With Christmas less than a week and a half away here, I am now, and I have been actually since really well before Thanksgiving. I've been in a mood of anticipation and excitement. It's always that way for me. I can kind of look at the world when this season of the year is here, this pre-Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving, Christmas time. I look at the world in kind of a different way. I look at the world more festive and more relational and more relaxing. I mean, after all, as we look up on the screen here, isn't Christmas meant to bring relief to us, especially if we are experiencing a hurting soul this year? Christmas is meant to do that, to bring relief to our less than perfect souls. But we know fully, don't we, just from the reality of the world that we live in, we know fully that Christmas doesn't really do that perfectly. And we also know from our survey into the book of Genesis that everything is seriously damaged in this world, including our souls. But Christmas is meant to break through all of this. It's meant to break through this world of darkness with His piercing light. In Scripture, we're given several indications of this. In fact, several indications in John's Gospel. Just listen to what John says. You don't have to turn here. John 8, Jesus says this about Himself: I am the light of the world, and he who follows me will not walk in darkness. In John 3, Jesus says this: light has come into the world, but men love the darkness. Paul picks up this very idea in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. He says, light shall shine out of darkness to show us the glory of God in Christ. Now that says it very succinctly. That whole picture we get there, that the glory of God, which is the same thing as saying the light of God is shown in Christ. And this light of God that is shown in Christ began at Christmas. And those are really good verses. And then there's also the passage that we're going to turn to this morning, which will give us a very unique perspective of what was happening at that moment when this light was coming into the world, at the very moment when God became man. Again, up on the screen. When Christmas was actually unfolding, something was lurking. And I use that word specifically. Something was lurking in the background of it all. It's a very sobering scene here when Jesus of Nazareth was meant to enter this world. A spiritual plot was hatched. We pick it up in Revelation chapter 12. Let's just read through the first 6 verses here. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon was under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, this is imagery we're going to look at here in a few moments that comes straight out of Genesis 37 and this dream that Joseph had. We'll pick up on that. Verse 2, and she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. Now, this is a picture that you get throughout the rest of the book of the Revelation. And those of you who are with us on Monday nights, you know this well already. I could call on any one of you, then you'd be able to tell me exactly what this is. This is a picture of the Antichrist, that Satan empowers the Antichrist, and he's pictured as this red dragon. And look what he does, verse 4. And his tail sweeps away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and throws them to the earth. Now, the picture here is that Satan is attempting a coup d'etat of heaven. And he is cast from heaven. Well, when is he cast from heaven? Well, the only time he can be cast from heaven is in the beginning, because there's only one beginning. It's not like Satan was hanging around in eternity past with God. He was created in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And Satan is just a created being. He's very powerful, the most powerful being God's ever created, but he is still a being. So as this war is taking place, and God is bringing the earth and the universe into being, there's a war taking place, and God and Satan is cast from heaven, and he ends up on planet Earth probably just after the 7th day of creation. And he brings 1/3 of the stars of heaven, which is a reference to angels. So 1/3 of the angels joined him in rebellion. Now, how many angels did God create? We don't know. Maybe it's billions, but we don't know. We're not told by the text here. Now, look what happens here in the second part of verse 4. There is a gap of time from the first part of verse 4 to the second part of verse 4. And John does this a lot. It now jumps to the manger scene. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth. so that when she gave birth, he might devour the child. And she gave birth to a son, a man to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now again, what Jesus does between verse 5 and verse 6 is there's another gap of time. He now jumps ahead. He goes all the way through. He jumps all the way through the entirety of the church age, which we're in right now. And he moves into the tribulation period, verse 6. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And that's a clear reference because it's used a lot in the Revelation of the 3.5-year period. The first 3.5-year period of the tribulation versus the second 3.5-year of the tribulation. So what we have here is significant imagery, and it needs some explaining. In fact, if you add to all of this, look over at verse 13. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth, when was he thrown down? Probably just after that seventh day of creation. Again, a big gap of time. He persecutes the woman who gave birth to a male child. So we have all this kind of imagery in here. It's a very picturesque way of describing these events. Now, there are two ways to analyze this scene here. The first that we're going to see up on the screen is this, is to look at this by way of a prophetic view of the birth of Jesus Christ. Here is that God has opened up the curtains of eternity to allow us to look behind the scenes, something that we see from earthly unfolding when we are reading the gospel accounts. In verse 1 here, the woman is depicted as the nation of Israel. Now, this imagery is used a lot in many of the prophetic books, as well as it being used here in John's revelation that he's being given. There's a number of indications here that line up with Genesis and the book of Daniel. In verse 1, we read that the woman, Israel, is clothed with the sun. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in Genesis 37, Jacob is pictured there as the sun and the moon, and Rachel, his wife, is under his feet. Now, if you remember the story, that was all a part of Joseph's dream. Joseph was a son of Jacob. And that's all a part of this dream that Joseph had. Remember that dream that got him into real big trouble with his father and with his brothers? This whole idea of his brothers being pictured in his dream as 11 stars who were bowing down to Joseph. Now, nobody really understood what it meant at that time, but they got angry. They didn't know how it was going to play itself out. Even his father Jacob saying, "What, are you telling us, Joseph, that we're all going to be bowing down to you?" And at that time, Joseph's going, "Well, I don't know. I'm just telling you what the end of the story." After a long ordeal, Joseph, he ends up as the second most powerful man in the world, and sure enough, his father and his brothers bow down to him. Well, Jacob, which comprises the nation of Israel here, is the picture that's taking place. This is what's unfolding here. And in verse 2 here, this woman, Israel, is with child. And she cries out in labor and pain. Now, this is the nation of Israel. We find later on in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, we'll get to that passage again a little bit later, but we find there that Israel and the entire world were ripe for the coming of Messiah. So this preparation for Israel was long, it was painful, just like childbirth. They went through multiple captivities, not just the captivity in Egypt. That was bad enough. That was 430 years. But then after the fall of the empire, you had the Assyrian captivity, you had the Babylonian captivity, the Medo-Persian captivity. And then after that, you've got these 400 silent years where God wasn't speaking to anyone. No prophet existed. There were false prophets, but no real prophet of God existed until John the Baptist comes on the scene. And now, as John is writing these words, he lives in a historical context. He lives in that first century under the dominion of Rome. Then we find in verse 3 that there's another sign, a fiery red dragon. This is a depiction of Satan himself. He has 7 heads and 10 arms, and he works his will through this person called the Antichrist, which is what you see later in the book of the Revelation. And this is speaking here of this coming confederation of governments, that the Antichrist, by way of the power of Satan, he'll collect this confederation of governments together to himself in the tribulation period to do battle against. But in John's present life, again, he lives in the context of the first century. This typifies the nation of Rome and all of its vassal states, including Israel, which is be one of many, including their king, Herod. when they conquered a land, oftentimes would leave the ruling power, the king or whatever, in place, because Rome would say to them, you keep order. If you don't keep order, we come and we take care of you. We'll take care of the problem. And then we find in verse 4 that this red dragon sweeps away a third of the stars of heaven, referring to his rebellion at the time of creation and his removal from heaven, along with all his co-conspirators, and moved by force. And you see more of this in Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28. Then in that last part of verse 4, the most pivotal part of it all, he was there. This red dragon was there, directing events from his dark realm at the Nativity. That's what was happening up there, but down here, it's all being done by proxy, by way of the attempt of Herod to destroy the child. So what we have here is a behind-the-scenes cosmic eternal battle that is unfolding when we read the Gospels. Again, look up on the screen. There was this plan of God from ages past to redeem man, which was first revealed when paradise was lost. Now, if you've been with us for the past several weeks, several months, you know the story already. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, after the fall of man, there is this promise given. It's what's called proto-evangelism, the first giving of the gospel. And if you were here with us, you remember these terms. There was a whole idea of this division of the seeds, that the woman would bruise Satan on the head, but he would bruise the woman or the seed of woman on the heel. Meaning Satan would harm Christ, but he would just bruise him. Christ would eventually kill the power of Satan. So this is the division of the seeds. There are these two kingdoms that rise up. Remember, the world builders and the kingdom builders. And it was the prophets and the apostles who saw this entire plan unfold through the ages past, and they waited in anticipation for it all to unfold. That's how Paul refers to it in the New Testament. Now, Paul is a post-crossed convert, of course. He comes along after Jesus has died and risen again and ascended to heaven. He gets converted afterward. But what happens in Paul's writings is he looks back at that. And he says that whole event of Christmas and Jesus living and him dying on the cross, that wasn't just some random thing. It wasn't God up in heaven kind of going, oh no, I can't believe it. They blew it in the garden. I made everything perfect. What are we going to do now? Hey, Jesus, are you ready to go down there? It's not how it worked. Paul records things like this. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 10, he says things like this. He refers to this time, administration suitable to the fullness of the time. Now, the use of the word administration is just a word that means a way of doing things. And that's how Paul is referring to this whole scene of Christmas leading up to his death and resurrection. It's an administration suitable to the fullness of the times, summing up all things. Later on in Ephesians, Paul refers to it as God's eternal purposes. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, a passage I mentioned already, he speaks of this time as the fullness of the time. The fullness of the time, I mean, it was ripe, it was ready, the fullness of the time when God sent forth his Son, born of a woman. In Romans 5:6, Paul refers to this, he says that it's at just the right time Christ died for sinners. It wasn't random. It wasn't haphazard. It was all planned out from eternity past. So these prophets, these apostles, waited in anticipation for it all. Think about the wise men. Remember those wise men? What we call the three wise men? We don't know that they're three wise men. We believe they're wise men. We just say that because they brought three gifts. When they travel in a caravan, usually there's several people who travel in a caravan. But it doesn't matter. Remember that story of the wise men? How did they make their way to Jesus? They didn't get to Jesus till he was 2 years old. How did they make their way? We find out in Scriptures that they came at just the right time because they observed the signs of the heavens. They calculated, they investigated, they waited, and they searched. So for all this time prior to the coming of Christ in that manger, the prophets and the apostles and others, they waited in anticipation, but so also did the forces of evil. Christmas, the Nativity, the Incarnation, God is now fully with us. Sometimes when we read about that whole story of the Gospels, especially Herod's attempt to kill Messiah. We think of that story that it was just some desperate maniacal king, and this was a desperate act on his part to save his throne because he knew that this Christ was coming and was going to assume the throne, and he misunderstood a lot of the prophecies. But we sometimes think it was just a desperate act of a maniacal king. It was a desperate act of a maniacal king trying to keep the throne. But that's not all it was. Not in the dark heavenlies. See, here's what we have to understand. Herod was an Edomite. That's important. His genealogy was that he was an Edomite. They were the historical enemies of the Jews. And what was odd about that is the Edomites were actually cousins to the nation of Israel. They were the descendants of Esau. Remember, Jacob and Esau were the two sons of Isaac. And Jacob was the younger. Esau was the older. Esau was the one who was supposed to receive that special blessing from his father. But Jacob, who wasn't a nice guy, Jacob was a derelict early on in his life. And he and his mother concoct the story to steal the birthright from Esau. And so when that happens, Esau leaves the camp and he disappears. Because the descendants of Esau, the Edomites, are not the ones who went into captivity in Egypt. It's only the Jews who did. So once the Jews escaped from Egypt and they make their way to the promised land, if you remember from Numbers chapter 20, they come up to the land of Edom. The land of Edom are all the descendants of Esau, the Edomites. And they want to travel through what is called the King's Highway through Edom to make their journey shorter going to the promised land. But the Edomites come out and say, no, you can't do that. There's too many of you here. You're going to destroy the land. And Moses promises them, look, we'll just travel on the land. We won't touch anything. And if we happen to touch anything, take any water, we will pay you for it. But the Edomites come out in force to prevent them. And they've been enemies ever since. That's the heritage of Herod here. So what Herod does is he takes what he was told in prophecy. He believes it. He misunderstood a lot of it, but he believes it. He takes what he is told from prophecy about the birth of this child in Bethlehem, and he plots to kill him. And this was all foretold by the prophets. This is something that had to happen. And even though Herod is the actor playing the role down here on earth, Satan is the director of it all. Let's take a look at these real events. Don't lose your place here. Now let's go over to Matthew chapter 2. Let's see how these dark forces in the heavenlies are being played out down here on planet Earth. Matthew 2, verse 13. Let's pick it up there. Now when they had gone, now who are they? They here are these men. Jesus is now somewhere around about 2 years old. They visited Herod because that's what they do. They're dignitaries. They came in and they visited the local king. And remember, Herod tells the Magi, oh yes, if you find this baby Jesus, let me know because I want to come worship him as well. Well, they don't know any difference. So they say, sure, fine, we'll do that. So they go off because they've calculated, searched. They find the Christ child. They present the gifts. But God comes to the Magi in the dream and says, no, you're not going back to see this guy. His days are numbered. You're going to go back home by a different route. So when they, the Magi, had gone from seeing Mary and Joseph, behold, an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream and says, get up, take the child and his mother and flee. Now those in the original text here, words are words of hate. You're not to collect yourself together. You just grab whatever you can grab that's in your arm length. Get on the donkey. Don't forget the baby. Get on the donkey and get your way to Egypt. These are terms of haste. And you're going to remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. Now we've got to point something out with this verse here because we like Christmas and we like the fanfare, and I love the nativity scene here. A proper nativity scene probably should have a red dragon somewhere up here. It's a beautiful scene here without the dragon. But notice what's taking place here. Remember, I've always told you that the two best ways to begin to interpret Scriptures, the first thing you do is you simply say, what is the text saying? It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. It doesn't mean you like it. It could even be wrong. It's not wrong, but I mean you could even say it's wrong. That's not the point. The point is the first rule of interpretation for anything is what is the text saying? And then second, what does it say within its text? So if I look at what the text is saying, I can also imply from this, another proper tool of interpretation is what is it not saying? What are we being told? Who is being rescued here? Jesus and the family. It's great. Who is not being rescued here? The rest of the kids in the village, 2 years and younger. They're not told, hey, get up, go to your neighbors, have them go to their neighbors, have them go to their neighbors, and tell them Herod is coming with an army and he's going to kill a bunch of kids. Get out of here now. They're told to get up in haste, get out. So verse 14, so Joseph got up. He took the child and his mother while it was still night, and he left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Something you couldn't plan in prophecy. This is another proof about the deity of Christ here. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all of its vicinity, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. Now, we can sit here and ask questions to ourselves, and they would be legitimate questions. Why did God allow this? I mean, in his sovereignty, how does he allow something like this? Why didn't he just tell Joseph, just tell your neighbor, get your kids out of here, have them tell their neighbors? I don't have the best answer for that, except to say, when we look at the Christmas story, the reason why Jesus came into this world is because of the terribleness and the bloodiness of sin. For all of the things you might be able to explain, we need to understand, as beautiful and as lovely as this is, Jesus came into this world to defeat and to conquer the bloodiness of sin. It was there at the manger. It's here after the manger scene. And it fulfills what was said. Verse 18, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more. Folks, when we look at this story, this was systematic. The details from history tell us that there were probably only about 1,000 people who lived in Bethlehem at the time and the surrounding villages. And probably, when you go by birth rates and stuff, only about a dozen to 15 children who 2 years and younger. Now, yeah, I realize I know what you're saying. That's awful enough, and it is. But this wasn't a mass extermination. This was a divine, evil plan to target and destroy the one child that mattered the most, thwart God's plan. Again, as we look up on the screen, Revelation tells us about Christmas and what it means to my hurting soul. Christmas reminds me that the darkness cannot restrain the emerging light. The events of the incarnation reassure this truth from deep within my heart. The darkness cannot prevail against the light. Before the Apostle John wrote the book of the Revelation, he recorded this about the baby in his own gospel in John chapter 1. Just listen to these words. He says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. And this light shines in the darkness, but the darkness did not comprehend it. Because of Christmas, nothing will ever be the same, and it's Christmas that seems to remind me most, because I want everything to be so perfect. It never is. But Christmas reminds me the most that life can never fully give me what I want, what I need. Because what I really desperately need is some way to know that I am loved beyond all human measure. And Christmas is my yearly reminder that I am. I am loved by God, so powerful that the combined forces of hell, using the most powerful nation the world has ever seen, pound for pound, if you just look at things in their context, Rome is still the most powerful nation that ever existed. That all the forces of hell, the most powerful nation in the world that the world has ever seen, could not frustrate the glorious plan of God to rescue you and me. And yet, paradoxically, this is a time, this Christmas season is a time when we can hurt the most, deep within our souls. Christmas seems to be one of these times when we get put into a temperament of reminiscing. You know, especially if you're a little bit older in life like I am. You know, the kids are no longer You know, they've grown up and they've moved away. Or maybe a loved one died. They've left because of some kind of a family breakup. Neighbors and friends that you once celebrated with Christmas with are no longer around. Maybe because you've moved away or they've moved away or someone has passed away. All of those things are the normal cycles of life. But it is in these normal cycles of life, and some of those that are not so normal, but it's in these normal cycles of life where I can feel desperately lonely. Christmas reminds me that God gave us what we need because it didn't come from us. And Christmas should shift our attention from what we don't have to what God has already given us. His love, which brings peace to our souls, one day at a time. It comes only by faith in Christ for the forgiveness of our sins, because it is our sins which brought God's wrath upon us. I have to know that. I have to believe that. I'm helpless to correct that. So in my helplessness, a child was born, unlike any other, and the plan to rescue mankind now at work. So this takes us to the second way which we can look at this passage in Revelation. We looked at a prophetic view of the birth of Christ. Now let's look at a prophetic view of the business of Christ. The business of Christ. What is he up to? See, what you have in Revelation is a panorama of the next two times that Jesus Christ is going to travel between heaven and hell bodily after his birth. We read from Revelation 12, verse 5, we read that she, Mary, gave birth to a male child. Now that is obviously the nativity scene in its fullness. And this child is going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Now that's not talking about heaven. Jesus isn't going to rule with a rod of iron in heaven. He won't need to, because there won't be any opposition in heaven. So it's talking about something else. See, this is his plan. This is the business of Christ. This is what he was up to, this fulfillment of which has been foretold by the prophets. Let's look at one of them. One passage. Go back now to Psalm 2. Psalm 2. I'm going to read very quickly from verse 1 down through verse 9. This is what he was up to. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? Now, if you read through the book of the Revelation, and again, those of you who have been there on Monday nights, you've seen this. You know this already. Especially in the tribulation period, when all these confederations of nations gather together because they're being deceived by the Antichrist and the power of Satan that is through him. And they come together to go to war with God. Can you imagine that? He deceives them. This is the picture here. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us." Now, that's played out in the tribulation period, but we see it played out here in our earthly realm all the time, right? All kinds of nations down through the centuries. Anybody take a look at China recently? China's attempt to wipe out Christianity, they've installed 200 million cameras to keep track of their citizenry, especially Christians. They want to install 300 million by the end of this next year. You tell me that's not a divine plan up there, working its way down here, saying we're going to stamp out Christianity. But every time they think they're stamping it out here, it's growing like this over here. Some estimates put China at 300 to 500 million Christians. I don't know how many. No one can really get in there and count. Because here's what happens, verse 4. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, "But as for me," you could add in there the word already, "I have already installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give you the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth will be your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware.'" He's talking specifically here about that millennial period. After the tribulation, there's that 1,000-year millennial period when Jesus will rule with an iron hand. Why does he have to rule with an iron hand? Because there are still people there who are not going to believe in him. They won't be able to act on it. That's the period when the lion lays down with the lamb. You'll literally be able to dive into the ocean and swim with great white sharks out there, and you won't have a problem with it. You'll be able to run out into the the fields of Africa and play around with the lion cubs in there, because there'll be peace upon the earth, but it'll be a forced peace. How do we know that? Because at the end of 1,000 years, Satan is let out of the bottomless pit to deceive the nations once more, and many will gather around him. So he rules with an iron hand. See, this is what Israel had available to them through Messiah. And again, let's go back to that Revelation passage. Revelation 12, we see in verse 5 here. It reads that her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, this is talking about the ascension. After Jesus dies and is placed in the tomb, and he rises again, and he spends 40 days on earth, then he ascends into heaven. And what John does here, as I mentioned earlier, between verse 5 and 6, he jumps over this large block of time, the church age, to get to his next point. And he does this a lot in this Revelation. Because the next great event here in verse 6 is the time of the tribulation. Look again. The woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for that 3.5 years. See, the scene here is that the rapture of the church has happened. And in that first 3.5 years, Israel is going to be under God's special protection and care until the really bad times begin. In fact, you can read about that here in this chapter from verse 13 and following. But again, look up on the screen. See, what we're seeing, Christmas, the incarnation, was all a part of a great plan. God's plan to redeem humanity. And these verses here, verses 5 and 6, says this about Christmas and my hurting soul. Christmas was all God's plan. Jesus has already gained the victory over the darkness of sin, and when he comes again, the victory will just be carried out in every aspect of heaven and earth. I love Christmas. I'm not alone in that. I realize that. Many people do. I always go into Christmas with high expectations of celebration and decorations and, getting the tree up and getting together with family and friends and relatives, having parties and meals and gifts and music and Christmas movies, and the list goes on and on and on. I love it. I absolutely love it. But you know what I hate about it all? Because there is a part to Christmas that I really, really hate, and it's something that comes up every single year. You know what it is? It's when it's all over. And you have to start putting everything away. Everything comes down, and you're coming down from the excitement. And you know what I learned from that every year, but I never think about it seriously going into Christmas? What I learned from this every single year is life cannot ever give me what I fully want. It's never lasting. And Christmas becomes my yearly reminder of it. But you know what? I'll try it next year, and probably the year after that. Let me give you a real-life example of all of this that not even children are exempt from. When my daughters were growing up, my wife and I decided at an early age possible they could understand, that what we were going to do with them when Christmas came along, especially when I appreciate the song that was sung about the line for Santa Claus. We wanted to be able to tell them in contradistinction to Santa Claus, the real story of Christmas. Because we just believe that the real story of Christmas was a better story. Now, don't get me wrong. I had no chip on my shoulder about Santa Claus. I grew up in a household where myself and my two older brothers, we believed in Santa Claus, and we would, in fact, my middle brother and I, who were closer in age, he still remembers these stories. You remember when Christmas Eve came, because we wanted to make sure that Santa Claus would show up. Now, somehow we still knew that parents bought gifts and put them under the trees, but somehow there were these special gifts that only Santa could bring. So we'd get into bed early, and we'd pull the covers over, and we'd have our flashlights, and we'd read comic books till we fell asleep. So I didn't come up with any kind of chip on my shoulder with Santa Claus whatsoever. But we just wanted our kids to know the real story. Well, my oldest daughter, when she was in second grade, she asked me the question, well, Daddy, what happens if I get asked about this? Because we want to warn them. You got to realize other kids may not know the story. And you're looking to burst their bubbles. Well, what happens if I get asked? Always be truthful. Just tell them the story of Christmas as you know it. Leave it at that. What if I get asked, Daddy, if I believe in Santa Claus? Just tell them the truth and just leave it at that. Don't any judgment on their end to this. This is fascinating to me that I'm actually telling you the story because as I was kind of planning this out a few weeks ago, the day after Thanksgiving, my daughters, for my birthday, took me and my wife to the Cleveland Playhouse to go see a play on my most favorite of all Christmas movies, Irving Berlin's White Christmas, Bing Crosby, Danny Kaye. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. There was a play on it. So we get there about an hour early, and you know, it's a nice ambiance to be there, and they got decorations up, and it's January as well. We're sitting in the balcony where there's just a walkway in front of us and then the railing here. And as I'm sitting there, I'm on one end, my son-in-law's on the other, and the three ladies are in the middle here. And I hear them talking, and I hear my daughter say something about that experience in second grade. And I said, what are you talking about? She says, that time in second grade when I got asked about Santa Claus. I go, oh, wow. I said, I'm going to use that in a few weeks for my Christmas message. Now, this next part I'm going to tell you here, I'm telling you the truth. I can't prove it to you. You're going to have to take my word for it. I'm telling you the truth. As she's telling the story, and I'm planning to use this here in a message, I kid you not, this chubby guy comes walking by, a full, pure white beard, mustache, and a full, fluffy head of hair. He walks by. And I stop. Erica, maybe we were wrong. But sure enough, she's in class. She gets asked the question, about the Christmas story and about Santa Claus, and she tells him, and she leaves it at that. And of course, class, that got around in about 1 minute, and she got some slack for it. She came home. She was hurt. I mean, she wasn't devastated, but she was hurt. And like all things in life like that, she got over it. She stood her ground. Life goes on. Now, I don't tell this story in any way to be judgmental about whether Christian parents should promote Santa Claus or not. I mean, I got to tell you right now, if you come and ask me, I'll probably just relate this story to you. You got to make that own decision for yourself. There are bigger crosses that I would rather bear in life than that. But here's what I've learned about this over the years in my theology. I didn't know I was going to learn this, but here's what I learned in my theology. Last thing up on the screen. You're not going to like it. Christmas is not for kids. Christmas is for a fallen world, a hurting human race that desperately needs a Savior. That all began at the incarnation and to continue until he comes again. And Christmas, with all of its fanfare, and I love the fanfare, but Christmas should shift my thinking, my very soul, away from my dependence on the joy and excitement that this season can give me, to a full dependence on that baby in the manger. Let's stand. Let's close in prayer. Our God and our Heavenly Father, I'll be the first to admit I love this time of year, and I love all of the peripheral stuff that goes into it, the concerts, the shopping, the decorations. I love it all. But I've also learned an ugly truth about it all. When I base my life, my joy, my excitement on just that alone, I realize how fleeting it is in life. And I hate that part of Christmas. And I've had to learn, as my life as a Christian went on, I had to learn in my theology that the only real dependence that matters to me is that baby in the manger. That child who lived and grew. That child who was and is my Savior. Who gave me eternal life simply for the asking. Who forgave my sins, promised me heaven simply for the asking, God. And that's where my dependence lies. Thank you for that, God. We should celebrate that. We should sing concerts and get together with friends and have meals. We should exchange gifts, but not losing sight of what it means to us. Thank you, God, that my hurting soul can turn to something that is lasting and permanent in eternity. Yes, I have to live through it in faithfulness in this life, but you will bring it to a conclusion, God, full and complete for all of eternity. Thank you for that in Jesus' name.